of a sudden, out of the blue, he shows up. It has been a great experience to meet him lately, and I'm very thankful for him to join us today. It would be nice, David, if you can tell us a little bit of the story of this project. Understand that it took place maybe working for Diane, something like that.
Yes, so shall we get started?
Yes, I think we can start, and some people might join in a few minutes.
Excellent. So I first allow me to thank you, Alvaro. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Gelvez. I actually wear many hats. Right now, I'm a research fellow at Fedesarollo, but I've done work in academia, banking, government, and most recently the Boston Consulting Group and the data and digital practice. And here with me is my colleague James Williams. We were both part of the Nicholas Christakis Human Nature Lab and the Yale Institute for Network Science back at Yale. James did his doctorate in applied mathematics, and right now he's joining us all the way from New Zealand. I don't know if James, if you want to present yourself a little bit.
Morning, everyone. Well, it's morning, at least where I am, early in the morning, 5:30 a.m. So it's a nice, bright and early sunrise outside the window. So following graduation from Yale University with David, and it was, I really appreciated being able to do my thesis working on this project with him. Since then, I've come back to New Zealand and I run a data science consulting company where I develop data-driven software for a range of different industry clients around machine learning, AI, and also automation of various processes. And I also teach at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, where I studied for my undergraduate. So I teach in their Masters of Applied Data Science program, and I manage all of their industry placements for the Masters of Applied Data Science students, of which we have about 100 starting projects next week. So life is busy, that plus 4 children, and it seems like it was a long time ago since we finished off grad school, even though it was only a few years.
So, and just as a final note, I don't know, Alvaro, if you remember, but you gave me my first job as an economist. So I'm delighted to be presenting here in your seminar at Quantil.
I remember work with you, but I just don't remember which projects.
Right. So the story of this project, if I may, revolved around, I think, 2 questions. And, you know, it is very important that James and I were part of Nicholas Christakis' lab because we are both network scientists. We speak the language of network science, but we come from different disciplines. I'm an economist by training, and James is a mathematician by training. Nonetheless, we were I guess, obsessed with 2 questions. The first is, what is the structure of production of a market economy? Just for those of you who would be watching later, the slides will be in Spanish and the presentation will be in English. And by structure, I mean, what is the topology of this system? That is an old question, and it's basically a large chunk of James' dissertation and a large chunk of my dissertation. What do we actually want to tackle in that very big question? 2 particular questions. The first is, how can we actually build a production network from administrative records? And digging into what Alvaro was just mentioning, we actually had the privilege of working with data from Diane. I know, Alvaro, since our last conversation, you actually, at Quantil, you guys were working with them. We had the privilege of working with them around 2015, 2016, taking 3 basic or 3 core administrative records that Diane has. The first one is Información Exógena, which is a third-party reporting scheme in which firms report whom did they business with. The second is Root, which is basically the ID or the identification or the characterization of every person that deals with Diane. And the third was the VAT records that enable us to track the sales and purchases of firms over time. It is a non-trivial data effort to actually put those 3 things together to build a production network. And given that Quantil is an applied mathematics company, we actually think that this is an important part of our work that we would like to share with you. The second is, what is the topology of that production network? And in particular, which is a connection between economics and network science, and it's what happens when we consider something that in economics we call the intensive margin of connection, which translates into considering what is the intensity of connection measured by the share of sales or purchases, or the actual value that is flowing between firms. In network science language, that means what happens when we consider this system not as a binary network, which is usually the work that had been done up to that point, but how do we consider it as a weighted network? And what are the topological differences between those two perspectives of the same system? So what is our contribution in that piece of work? And James, feel free to add up whatever you think is necessary. The first is that we actually managed to create an entire data pipeline, James mostly did, of how do we actually combine these three administrative records, taking into account that we had to do very careful data quality checks that are incentive compatible. We should not forget that DIAN is a tax agency, and the data we are observing was actually filled within a strategic framework. So we had to do extensive validations to actually check that those administrative records actually are useful to build this anatomy of the Colombian economy. The second is that we actually found, as was found previously in other knowledge domains, that the intensive margin matters to actually understand what is the topology of this the production networks that comprise the Colombian economy. And I would like to pinpoint two particular matters, or two important matters. The first is that weak connections matter. This has been found in the sociological literature, this has been mentioned of the strength of the weak ties, but we actually in the Granovetter paper back in the, I think, 70s. But we find exactly the same feature within an economic context, in which the links that represent 1% or less of purchases or sales are topologically important to connect the network. And while the network is itself one particular entity, a strongly connected component comprises the whole network, the weak connections actually work as cutoffs, as shortcuts, between firms. The second and very important thing for the second piece of work that I would like to sketch today is that the intensive margin actually matters a lot. When you compare the position of a given firm, considering its binary, from a binary perspective, just counting, for instance, the in degree or out degree, there is a wide degree of heterogeneity of how that same firm locates in the network, considering the intensive margin of connectivity. And just to give you a number, 25% of firms in the 5th decile, in terms of the in degree, are actually in the 8th and 9th degree of the intensity of connectivity. So it is a non-trivial piece of information to actually consider the network as a weighted one vis-a-vis a binary one. So far, so good. Any questions? So that's a fair summary of like the first body of work of what is the structure of a production network in the Colombian context. Literature, a lot of literature, but actually I just wanted to highlight 3 particular issues that we actually tackle in a very clear sense, and one very big contribution that James led in this effort. The first is that at the time, building a production network from administrative records was actually being done in parallel all over the world. We actually think we were the first ones who did it for a developing country, but none of the countries around the world so far, or the research teams around the world so far, have managed to build a production network that merges multiple third-party reports. Información exógena is comprised of many relationship reports. Usually around the world, firms report whom they bought to and whom they bought to and whom they sold to. in Colombia, it is reported you bought or you sold a particular financial or accounting item. So we actually figure out how to actually aggregate them in a way that makes sense. In terms of the topology of production, most of the papers were actually focused on the degree distribution, at least in the economics literature. We actually have a full characterization in the 5 characteristics that we think define the network topology in a greater sense. And importantly, and this is a message that we want to convey, James led the construction of an extension of the SNAP library of Judah Leshkovec in Stanford. James and I extended that library to process large-scale networks, large-scale weighted networks, which at the time was not possible at scale. So this is available on GitHub. I think when I share the presentation, I would pinpoint the link in which that's available. And this is a contribution, a toolbox contribution that we did in this piece of work. Now, why we did that? Because that sounds like a very interesting applied mathematics project. We did that because we were interested in a very classical economic question, which is, how do shocks diffuse in production networks? This is not a new question. This is actually a classical question. This goes back to Leontiev or even before that. But we actually know that shocks diffuse in production networks, but we don't know how what are the diffusion patterns? What are the details, right? How do actually firms react in face of a given shock? Why this is important? Because most of the macro literature so far thinks about the diffusion of shocks in terms of sectors, but we know that there is inherent heterogeneity in the firms that comprise a given sector. So building an object that enables us to understand firm-to-firm connections within a given sectors and across sectors provides a much more detailed and much more accurate representation of the economy, hence enable us to estimate how diffusion actually happens. And this was my job market paper, and it focuses in 2 economic questions. The first one is, what are the direct and indirect effects on our firms? Focusing on 3 matters. The first is, what are the effects on the extensive margin of firms? Meaning if firms enter or exit, particularly if they exit. It sounds trivial from a theoretical standpoint that firms eventually exit if the shock is large enough, but there wasn't at the time any empirical research particularly of indirect exit effects of a given shock in the context of a production network. That is itself a baseline result. The second question pertaining direct and indirect effects over firms is about liquidity and demand shocks. In particular, if the diffusion patterns of liquidity and demand shocks are mostly different. And in fact, the macro literature actually documents that under the most common theoretical framework, Cobb-Douglas, for instance, demand shocks have actually upstream effects, but no downstream effects. That is, effects on suppliers, but not effects on customers. And what I found using this data and the shocks that I will explain in a little bit is that we actually find downstream effects, which is something that wasn't clear in the literature. And the third one that combines the prior 2 questions, and that's the complexity of thinking, how are shocks different depending on the type of firms? The shocks that I will be using are policy shocks, are trade policy shocks, and pertain changes in trade policy that Venezuela did over the first decade of the 2000s, the first decade. And it is not clear how different trade shocks or how trade shocks affect different types of exporters and their supply chains. In particular, it is not clear at the time, or it's not studied at the time, if shocks that affect direct exporters, meaning exporters that sell directly their merchandise to their counterparts in Venezuela in this case, react differently to those exporters that export indirectly, meaning exporting through trading companies. How diffusion or how the indirect effects of these shocks through and their supply chains actually differ. Exporters, direct exporters, which are usually larger, are more sophisticated firms, work as liquidity buffers vis-a-vis indirect exporters. That is one of the most important findings in this case. And finally, the policy question around here is what actually happened with the trade embargo. You know, for those of us Colombians, and I think James actually became an expert on that, we had a quasi-trade embargo on 2009 out of political turmoil between President Uribe and President Chavez. But the story is a bit more complex because Venezuela systematically implemented a trade policy under a managed exchange rate regime. And that understanding of the sequence of trade policy actually enabled us to understand what were the direct and indirect impacts of those policy changes of Colombia's second most important partner at the time and the first destination for non-traditional exports. I think that I summarized already what did we find. So I'm going to skip through this. And then related to the literature contribution, just to give you a sense of it, this is not extensive. There isn't much evidence about the diffusion of real shocks in terms of what is the impact of the extensive margin. Most of the evidence is actually concerned with the direct suppliers or customers. We do this, or I do this, considering the entire supply chains up to 3 degrees away or 3 steps away. The discussion on demand shocks is actually irrelevant. Very few evidence or very little evidence on demand shocks. Most of the diffusion literature is concerned with disruptions on the supply side. And finally, as you will see, the empirical strategy that I adopt is a very detailed regression that enable us to consider effects, direct or indirect, of a given shock, controlling for the effects of other potential shocks in all directions and intensities. That also has not been considered before. In terms of liquidity shocks, I already explained the comparative perspective with demand. The diffusion of shocks under intermediated trade, which compares direct and indirect exporters, that also has not been done before, just under one instance in Belgium. And our understanding of the trade relationship between Colombia and Venezuela was mostly concerned out of very nice research out of the Colombian Central Bank, focused on what happens with exporters, but not with their supply chains. So that's a large, or the big picture story of the 2 works that we wanted to discuss today. So what do we want to do? I want to show you the empirical strategy we use to study the diffusion of shocks. And within that empirical strategy, I want to take a sideways and explain what are the main results of the architecture of this production network that we just discussed. Then, if time allows, I will elaborate on the 3 questions that I just laid out: the effects on the extensive margin, the comparison between demand shocks and liquidity shocks, and the comparison of the different effects of liquidity shocks for different type of exporters. Finally, from a macro, this ends up being a trade/macro work, and usually that type of work ends up with an estimation of what are the aggregate effects. So I will show you that amounts around 1% of GDP for about 3 years, which is non-negligible. And I would love to discuss alongside with James what are the next steps, because we built this huge data set that we actually don't have right now, because that is on a server at DIAN. We wish we had it, but we don't, because it is extremely confidential. But we learn a lot about production networks themselves and about the dynamics of networks. And how do we actually think about that over time? How do we think about statistical significance of network change over time? So any questions so far? James, would you like to add anything else?
None so far.
Great. So the empirical strategy to tackle the diffusion of shocks question has 4 components. The first is the data on the firm-to-firm relationship data that I will discuss in brief. Second, to understand and codify the trade policy shocks. The third is to define the treatment and control setup and what does exposure mean in this context. And finally, to propose a baseline econometric specification, or the workhorse specification that would enable me to build up to estimate more complex shock or diffusion patterns. So let's talk about network architecture. So what we did, we built a panel of networks for the Colombian economy for 2006 to 2012. And that is a beautiful period because tax reforms actually enable us to build relatively comparable networks out of the administrative records we use. As I mentioned before, we used three base ones: información exógena, which is a third-party reporting scheme in which firms along the Colombian economy that are large enough report whom they bought to and who they sold to for particular accounting items. The second is the VAT forms, in which firms report total sales and purchases with certain granularity in a given year. And the third one is ROOT, which reports the firm characteristics. We extracted, processed, cleaned, and aggregated all these three things for a given year. And I'll show you what that means in a little bit. In the end, we will be focused from a cross-sectional standpoint in the 2007 network, which is going to be extremely important because we will track the effects of the shocks that started happening on 2008. So in an instrumental variable setup, we would like to have a network that is correlated with the network structure in 2008 and 2009, but is not affected by the shocks of interest. The 2007 network comprises 130,000 firms that cover around 50% of private value added, which is not so bad. That comprises basically the formal private economy that Diane observes. And that network has 1.3 million relationships. And when you remove the weak connections, has around 800,000 connections or relationships. So what did we do? And this is a bit of data processing, but given that we are in an applied mathematics seminar, I think this would be interesting. And also, if you ever work with Diane again, this would be interesting to know. Información exógena is reported in a set of formatos, which have conceptos. In the end, we selected 5 conceptos, which basically are operational revenue. How much of my operational revenue comes from a third party? How much of my purchases of intermediates, purchases of something that could be interpreted of capital goods, purchases of services that comes from honoraries and wages. So while this is not an input-output matrix at the firm level, we selected the information at the end that was relevant enough to track something that looks like an input-output matrix. And we did a bunch of validations in terms of how this information is contrast with itself. What I report I bought from you should be consistent with what you report you sold me. That is basically the gist of it. And we did that in different aggregation levels, so that we could guarantee that to the best of our effort, we had data of the best quality possible. That is a question that I've gotten lately, and is how do you know that this actually is that data is the data that you guys built is of good quality? Our answer is we did the best that we can, using different DIAN information assets to validate them in an incentive compatible way, because there is actually there isn't a direct object that we can compare outside DIAN. This panel goes from around 110,000 nodes to 170,000 nodes, and goes from 1.1 million relationships to 3.6 million between 2006 and 2012. And in terms of the proportion of the value that those relationships represent in terms of GDP, it goes from 36% to 20%, meaning that as the economy grows, we get more value in absolute levels, but it covers less in terms of in relative levels. Let's talk a little bit about the topology. And here we start thinking about different metrics that comprise or represent the network. So the first and the most basic part is thinking is if the network is actually connected. Meaning the economy could be a set of disconnected islands. Think about them, you know, in a set of islands that are disconnected. Or it could be an entire continent, right? The first finding, as I mentioned before, is that the economy is actually a single continent. More than 98% of firms are actually connected in terms of having a path that connects them directly or indirectly. Now, given that the economy is a single continent, what is the distance in terms of the number of links that it takes to get from one firm to another, from this 130,000 firms? Eventually, all firms are connected at distance 8. It takes at most 8 steps to get from one firm to another. For a reference point, the Japanese production network in the same year, it would take 13 steps. So we are, you know, it makes sense in terms of us Colombians being a smaller economy. Now, given that we were focusing the intensive margin, what happens when you remove these weak connections? What happens with that connectivity between a given firm and another? And what we find is that firms are still connected at distance 8, but it takes more steps to get from one firm to another. That's why the entire network, the full network, the distribution is shifted to the left, while the distribution of the 1% network, or the network in which we remove the links of 1% or less, is actually more shifted to the right. In terms of the degree distribution, yes.
Sorry, David. This is quite interesting. I've never seen something like that. So, is there a relationship between the average distance between two firms and development of the country? I mean, Japan, you said 13, and
yes.
US is what?
There are calculations for the US, but they're not comparable, because the data from the US is based on public reports that are reported to the Securities Exchange Commission or newspapers. So the way in which the network is built is not directly comparable. But if you compare, say, Japan, or say Chile, or say the countries that have that, the countries for which there is comparable data, there is indeed a relationship between GDP and network size of the distance between firms. Still, there are very few countries for which this has been done. So we cannot run a regression and tell you like the elasticity is whatever, right? We would love, at this point, Vasco Carvalho and colleagues at Cambridge University are leading a worldwide supply chain project, and probably that's one of the questions they will tackle. But your question connects to the complexity idea of Ricardo Hausmann and Cesar Hidalgo, like the more complex an economy gets, the more developed it is. The perspective we bring to the table in terms of like measuring the complexity of an economy from a network science perspective is what is the average neighborhood function or the diameter of the network. I don't know if James would like to add to the question, to the answer.
I think you've summarized it well. It's the transactional level nature of the data set that really lends itself to this approach. And it was very interesting to be able to see how changing thresholds to include or exclude different firms in the network affected the path distances within the network between any pair of firms. And this is just showing that as a high level aggregate by looking at the neighborhood function. but you could also look at specific individual firms and see how their connections changed to other firms in the network, which allowed quite a unique drill down when you wanted to investigate any specific phenomena around firms that had noteworthy economic activity. For example, comparing to firms that appeared in the Panama Papers, as an example.
Another perspective that I actually didn't bring it because we brought a lot of material, but we have a third piece of work, which is far simpler, that deals with the centrality of exporters. So I cannot give you a good answer of, is the GDP compared to the network diameter across countries, but we can show you, or at least the data can show you, that exporters are more productive, and there are special firms, they tend to be more central in the network. So they locate strategically.
So the more developed, the more central you are as an exporter.
Exporters are more central. We did not investigate the causality. If you're more central, you become an exporter, or vice versa. If you're still, when we were dealing with the identification strategies of how to run the regression, there is a lot of overlap in the supply chains of exporters. For instance, around 20% of suppliers to firms that export to Venezuela are themselves exporters to Venezuela, and that is consistent across destinations. So the special firms overlap themselves. So more sophisticated firms overlap themselves. This is not in the Belgium setup. They ask a relatively similar questions in terms of productivity, and it actually holds in a very similar fashion. In terms of the heterogeneity of connectivity, we wanted to highlight two things. The first is that the shape of the distribution, which is extremely informative, for instance, is the macro models of the likelihood of tail risks, is actually very different. This one is the binary in-degree distribution, and this one is the weighted in-degree distribution. The distribution shapes are extremely different. And in terms of the movements of the distribution that I summarized in the beginning, if the intensive margin of connectivity did not bring any additional information, we would expect this matrix to be diagonal. It isn't by any means. Firms that are more connected from a binary perspective are less connected from an intensive margin perspective, and vice versa. And this is non-trivial when you actually drill down in terms of the top supplier or the top customer. The top supplier could be from the 25th quintile would be 2%, to the 75th quintile it could be 22%. In fact, some firms that are in the tail of the distribution are almost entirely dependent of a given firm. Something similar happens in terms of the buyers, right? I would like to insist that we would not be able to do this if James didn't lead the work of building how to process these networks at scale. We were able to do this out of computational resources that were available for us at Dian, but also because we were able to extend the C++ library that enabled us to process this, big matrices. In essence, processing networks implies traversing through matrices or inverting matrices, and we were dealing with matrices of 100,000 by 100,000 or more. So this is a very important contribution that I would like to insist. The package we built was within the framework of the SNAP library that Jure Leszkovic maintains at Stanford. And for you to know, this library is used in a production environment by Pinterest or many other companies. So this for applied mathematics projects that concern network science, the weighted extension that we did is interesting, but it's even more interesting this SNAP library that I will be happy to share more details if you wanted to. So I think I have 20 minutes, around 20 minutes. So I will go through this fairly quickly. Nonetheless, we will make available this material for you guys. Any questions about network topology or something else you want to discuss?
Maybe I would like to know if you have any descriptive statistics or description of these networks at different points in time. How do you really, what are the sort of statistics that are interesting for describing the networks?
I would delegate James that answer, because that was part of his doctoral dissertation. So,
sorry, would you mind just repeating the question?
No, I just wonder what kind of statistics you use to describe the dynamics of these networks.
Dynamics in terms of how the network topology evolved year on year?
Yeah.
That is something that we didn't quite get to modeling that out thoroughly by the conclusion of my thesis, at least. And it is something I definitely would like to explore in future work. It's challenging in that the way in which the firms rewire is a very much a full network thing. So you can look at high level network statistics, and we did things like the neighborhood function, and seeing how some of those aggregate behaviors of the network change. But to an extent, those are reasonably static for the specific economy. So they're very, very slowly changing aggregate features. But looking at a single individual firm, you can easily look at how the characteristics, the centrality measures of individual firms change. But then it's also hard to aggregate, or to present an aggregate view of that change in per node measures that is informative. The fact that centrality change moves around a little bit for all of the nodes, you have a distribution of how the centrality changes, and it doesn't really tell you anything meaningful until you look at it at the per node level. And there are so many nodes. When you're drilling down at that level, it's because you're trying to answer a specific question. It's not something you can easily present in a large single PDF table, for example. But it does present a really useful tool to be able to do that ad hoc analysis and looking at how a single firm's neighborhood changes over time.
I would like to add up to that, Alvaro, that the two important things that James, one of them is that we didn't get into network dynamics because network dynamics is inherently noisy.
Yep.
So in order to provide a proper answer to your question, we would need to have a notion of inference and a notion of a null model. We play with it. We actually in the C++ library, James actually coded some ways in which you could generate null models according to different theoretical models of networks, because we would need to have a notion of how the network evolves to actually check if the observed changes are actually statistically significant or not. That is a complex problem that so far, at least of what I've tracked in the literature, has not been dealt with, at least so far. The second, from a more economic standpoint, is that there are some sufficient, you might think in the network context in terms of sufficient statistics to describe the network, and you could track how those sufficient statistics evolve. Let me get back to this. As James said, this should be at least question-driven, ideally theory-driven. In the macro literature, one very important observable is the degree distribution, particularly the shape of the distribution and the size of the tail changes over time. That is reasonable. But then when you realize this, then you need to check not only the shape, but also the composition of the distribution. Because as James was mentioning, it is not only important to understand what is happening at the macro level in terms of the shape of the distribution, but also the micro level of how firms are moving around. There is also something that we don't show here, but we showed back in the seminar at the lab, and is that there is an intermediate level of analysis, which we call meso, which are basically the communities that emerge around the network. because then you could have, it could be the case that you have a constant degree distribution over time, but the composition of that distribution function, or the distribution probability distribution, it can be interpreted that way, is comprised of different components or different communities, which is in fact something we observed, because in face of the shock, firms rewired. You know, before the shock, firms were selling, you know, refrigerators to Venezuela. After the shock, no more refrigerators to Venezuela. What do we do, right? And then when you go back, even an additional level, then the position of a given firm can change, right? Any other question? No? Shall we go on?
Yep.
Right. So that's a very interesting network science part of it. But then it comes a trade policy part of it. We spend a lot of time building the data set, the network data set, but we also spend a lot of time understanding the policies that were affecting these networks. And it is very interesting to share with you guys that there wasn't one shock, there were 3 shocks. That actually, there were 3 policy changes and 5 shocks that affected the Colombian economy from January 2008 to July 2009. That is something that we didn't have clarity before. The first is a car quota, which is essentially the Venezuelan government imposed a quota on Colombian car sales, assigning 15,000 vehicles on January 2008 and 10,000 in March 2009. So you have an idea, this is about a third of what Colombia used to sell before. So this is big. The third, which is less obvious, and there were changes in how importers to Venezuela were able to access USD at the official exchange rate. Just to provide a little bit of context, Venezuela under Chavez transitioned from a floating exchange rate regime to a fixed exchange regime. But it is not only fixed, it's managed. And in particular, the Venezuelan government decided to prioritize access to cheap USD, meaning access to dollars that were sold and purchased at the official exchange rate for a given set of goods. And that list of the given set of goods and how many dollars were available, or how much USD was available over time, changed. When the Great Trade Collapse occurred, there was a commodities collapse, which translated into a liquidity shock from a Venezuela point of view, that translated into a liquidity shock for Colombian exporters that started to get delays on their payments. And that's a critical thing from understanding the trade finance in an international trade context. People usually sell the goods and expect to be repaid in a given period. That period is even longer when you sell abroad. So this is a non-trivial shock from a firm standpoint. And then the most known shock, which is the trade embargo that Chavez declared over Colombia on July 2009. Let me get into the details of the liquidity shock, or at least the discussion of how did we map these shocks at a good level, in particular at an HS10 level. And this comes to the Cadivi list, which basically was a list that outlined for every tariff line, which had a given tier of access to US dollars at the official exchange rate. We mapped this from 2003 until 2010 to actually understand how goods came in and out of this list and to which tiers of access were put in a given period. There were 2 tiers from 2008 onwards. Priority, say medications or whatever the Venezuelan government thought as priority, and then conditional, which were goods that the Venezuelan government was interested in importing, say auto parts, but they were not, I would say, critical. Now, there were other goods that they were not in this list. So if Venezuelan importers wanted to purchase or to import these goods from abroad, they had to go to the gray market and later the black market to actually get the dollars to pay for those goods. This means that in a given point in time, there were 3 tiers of access to USD as the official exchange rate: priority, conditional, and without access. And we will focus on 2 points in time that had large changes in this list: March 2008 and May 2009. When we consider the card quota, the access to the USD, and the timeline of the embargo, we can split Colombian exports in 5 groups that are, that are defined by the type of products or the particular type of products that they sell according to the list that I just mentioned. Out of those 5 groups, we can split them into 3 groups. 2 of them have a clearly well-defined shock. Those that had conditional access from March 2009 were exposed to a liquidity shock. In March 2009, there was a halt in payments. We confirmed that with bureaucrats of the Colombian government, even from the Venezuelan government at the time that were by then refugees in Colombia, and with entrepreneurs that were actually complaining about this. This was also in the news. Then we have two clearly defined demand shocks: the card quota and those goods that had no access or conditional access from 2009, that had no access in 2008, and that were given conditional access in May 2009, which were basically goods that were never given access to cheap US dollars. So whatever movement or whatever changes in terms of like the quantity demanded are clearly moved not by the access to a given exchange rate, but by market conditions. And then we have 2 other groups that have the two types of shocks combined. Why this matters? Because when you plot the change in exports for all exports without discriminating around these five product groups defined by the 3 policy shocks, you would get something like, okay, in 2007 the exports were growing still, and then there is a slump, and finally when the embargo was announced, it plummets. When you plot the change in exports according to these different product groups, there are differences in the timing and intensity of when export actually started collapsing. You can see here at the time the gray line plots when the shock is actually relevant. Those affected by the card quota plummeted when the card quota started. Those affected by the liquidity shock started to plummet at least a few months later after the shock was announced. Those who were not subject to any liquidity shock and then subject to a demand shock plummet when the actual shock of the embargo starts coming up. So identifying properly these policy shocks enable us to identify the particular exposure of a given firm. I don't know if you have any questions around that point. No questions? Good. Then we get to the point of how to measure direct and indirect exposure. For direct exposure is measured for exporters, and what we calculate is the share of sales to a given market: Venezuela, middle income, and large and high income. This is very important because at the time the Colombian economy was exposed to 2 shocks: the Venezuelan shocks that I just explained, but also the Great Trade Collapse. So any regression that wants to identify these effects has to control for the Great Trade Collapse in order to understand what were the effects of the Venezuelan shocks. And then indirect exposure is calculated by combining the direct exposure in terms of the shares of sales and the shares of sales to Venezuela or to the other markets, and a metric of exposure calculated by the product of the different shares of sales or purchases in a given supply chain. If this were an input-output matrix, one could calculate for a given firm what is the proportion of output that is sold by a firm X degrees or X links away. We can't do that because this is not an input-output matrix. But we can approximate this using the share of sales a given firm sells to its supplier and that to its supplier, so we can provide an approximation. This is an illustration of the point. So exporters to Venezuela are defined as the suppliers, as the reference point, so we can map their suppliers going upstream, and then their buyers going downstream. Reality is more complicated. Supply chains are not vertical in reality. There are loops, as I just mentioned. So, my supplier can be my buyer at once, and many other types of relationships. When you have the data and the library that James and I built, you can quantify the paths from the exporters to Venezuela to every other firm in the economy. Then you can classify which firms are 1 degree away, or 1 order away, or first 1 order away, 2 orders away, 3 orders away, from a buyer standpoint and a supplier standpoint. And with the intensity data that I just mentioned, you can calculate a metric of indirect exposure to the shocks. And this is the metric of indirect exposure. If you remember the degree distribution that I just showed you a few minutes ago, it resembles the shape of the distribution, but it's not the same thing, right? Note that exposure, as you move from a direct relationship to a relationship that is mediated by other firms, it decreases. Note that there is a non-trivial set of firms that has a high degree of exposure, even 2 or even 3 degrees away. So what we do is that we define a treatment and control setup following prior work by Vasco Carvalho at Cambridge, in which firms that are far away enough can be considered as controls, and firms that are close enough to the, I would say, epicenter of a shock are treated as treatment group. We do that for up to third order exposed firms or third order connected firms. And then for firms that are 4 degrees or more away, that comprise around 50,000 firms, are the control group.
But David, I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that this is not an input-output sort of a matrix, or you can't get that from this, but it seems to be an approximation or not, because
it is a fairly reasonable approximation, but I always do the disclaimer because economists would like to observe the proportion of output that firm 3 produces that is embedded in this exporter. What we can observe is the proportion of output that this firm sold to this firm, the proportion of output that this firm sold to this firm, and the proportion of output that this firm sold to this firm. So it is possible that the output that this firm sold to this firm, it is not embedded in the products that this firm sells to this firm, right? So we could solve that problem if we had access to the electronic invoice data, because then you would have what products were sold to a given firm at a given time. But with this, one-step information set, it is an approximation, a reasonable one nonetheless.
So if it's a reasonable approximation and you use this kind of analysis that these people usually do, this Leontief matrix, and they kind of measure the importance of one shock from one sector to the other using these Leontief coefficients, isn't that a useful statistic for these things?
We took a different approach. This is a picture of the 2007, a portion of the 2007 networks in which the black dots are exporters. So to show the point of overlap. And given the intellectual tradition of our lab, what we wanted to do is to quantify the causal effect. So we wanted to actually measure the coefficients of the regression, right? And this is useful because we can actually compare them to other knowledge domains to check if the diffusion patterns are actually similar or not. Nonetheless, you could, think that this input-output, this production network resembles an input-output matrix and estimate the Leontief coefficients. We didn't do that, at least directly. We did them indirectly because we estimated the centrality scores, which are mathematically very similar, but we didn't explore that in that sense. I have 5 minutes, so I just want to discuss the baseline specification and probably get to the next steps that I think are most important for this seminar. So we basically, the regression had 3 parts. The first is to estimate the direct effects, the effects on the suppliers, and the effect on the buyers exposed to the shocks. The second part was to estimate indirectly the effects, the direct and indirect effects of other shocks, meaning the shocks coming from the plummeting demand from the US out of the Great Recession represented in the Great Trade Collapse. And the third part is to include fixed effects over time and fixed effects at the firm level. And this regression under the setup that I just explained is well identified. It is non-trivial that it is well identified. That's what I want to make the point. One particular matter that we were actually, and I was particularly obsessed, and is that the stable unit value treatment assumption holds. Because in a network sense, the fact that one unit is treated, it does not exclude that a nearby unit or a connected unit, it is also treated as well. And if you really want to estimate the causal effect, you really have to take that seriously. There are different routes to how to do that. I chose this one that includes controlling for everything and isolate the effects of far enough firms. There are different ways of estimating that causal effect that other member of our lab, Laura Forastiere and Eduardo Airoldi, explore of how to do this from a different econometric standpoint or causal inference standpoint. I want to show you this, which is basically the most detailed regression and the most precise, because the paper, the economics paper builds from the coarser shock definition to the finer shock definition to show how a better definition of what trade policy means matters, right? But this is the most accurate regression that shows that at indirect effects can go up to mostly second order, at least in these particular cases. In some cases, they could go up to third order. This is the comparison of the indirect effects, the upstream indirect effects of a liquidity shock for direct exporters, vis-a-vis the indirect effects for indirect exporters. Exporters act as liquidity buffers, as I was mentioning, because they're larger firms and they can absorb whatever liquidity shock comes from abroad. Indirect exporters do not. They translate the shocks to their suppliers, which is another result and an interesting result from an international trade standpoint. There are other results that I would happily share when we share this presentation and with the working papers that we will be releasing. Now, given the applied math context and taking 1 more minute, where can we take this? Given that despite not having the data, because this was a very big investment that James and I did building this data object. The first is the discussion we had at the beginning, which is how the structure of the Colombian economy changed vis-a-vis the shocks. Because this work, the second strand of work documents how the shocks diffused throughout the economy, but it is pending to understand if shocks actually were able to change the structure of the Colombian economy and what that means. That's a discussion we had. That's a non-trivial question, and it is also a question that it is applicable to many other knowledge domains. The second pertains of what happens with the foreign markets. Where did the exporters go, to what products, and upon what relationships they built those new bridges? That is something that Juan Esteban Carranza is actually thinking. What would be alternative methods to calculate the causal effects? And finally, there is, we track the diffusion of shocks using a real network. There is a large strand of literature that maps the diffusion of shocks in financial networks. If data were available to us, we could do the same exercise, but considering accounts payable and accounts receivable, which would be an entirely different perspective on how shocks would diffuse. Given that Tatiana said that we could share the slides, I will be happy to share the slides, and we would release this in working paper versions soon. But I wanted to, knowingly that we wouldn't have enough time, I would just show you the work we did with an applied math slant, so we could have a conversation. I don't know if James would like to add up anything else, or anyone else would like to add up something.
David and James, I think it was great. Really very nice. I didn't know much about this, and the specification and the econometrics seems very interesting also. So I would love to read a working paper and have a look at the presentation. I usually teach some stuff on networks in one of these courses I teach at Los Andes. And I see some very interesting material to enrich my course, the applications and stuff like that. So this econometric part, it's very interesting too. I think it was fantastic. I would really like to read whatever you guys finish.
Absolutely. We this as you can intuit, this was a long effort, very long. There's a lot of effort put into this of James and myself. So we are recovering back from that effort and putting it into a working paper version. And we would, I would like to insist 3 things. The first is that this is a way of thinking, and it's a different way to ask economic questions. The second is that we built data assets, some of them private, but some of them public. The public ones will be made available. The mapping of the Venezuelan shocks, we will release them. And the third one is the toolbox. There are many toolboxes around, but not to the best of my knowledge, still nothing around analyzing at scale large networks. And that is very important. So we would like people to know that and to use it. And thank you, Alvaro, for the invitation, and thank you, James, for waking up early to be with us.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. So
Pleasure.
guys, this seminar, it's open for you to share whatever you guys want in the future. And yeah, and please send us something to read and learn more about this.
Absolutely.
Okay, nobody
Great.
else has a question?
No, thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I do think there are many things I don't know that some of the people that worked for Diane are not here except Diego. That I don't know if he had the time to pay attention to all, but maybe at some point it would be nice to understand what the people from Quantil did for Diane, which is mostly related to finding anomalous behavior in this, what you said, you talked about this in incentive compatibility and all the effort you guys did. well, if you had to do a lot of effort, is because there were weird things also in the data you guys were analyzing. And I don't think we at Quantil pursue any network analysis kind of thing to identify this anomalous behavior. So that would be maybe another contribution you guys can do from your big data, how to identify this kind of manipulation or atypical behavior.
We actually found several of those, but we did not write about them because it was that was kind of the IP that was left to the end, basically. But people from the end actually found networks with paths to nowhere. That is classic money laundering. And there is also an approach which comes from a modeling technique that has been used to detect credit card fraud, which comes from graph learning. When you start identifying graphs that have anomalous topological features, that is used all the time to identify credit card fraud. So lots of interesting things over there. In the degree distribution, there is a professor in Carnegie Mellon that identifies anomalous behaviors out of deviations of the degree distribution from a degree distribution standpoint, or firms that should be in a given connectivity level that are not. So lots of interesting things, Alvaro and Diego and the rest of people who are watching.
Yes, to complement what Alvaro was saying, because this is pretty interesting. We tried to do some graphs when we were exploring data in the end. We didn't have good enough data in the data they gave us was incomplete and was old and so on. But for example, they told us about typologies of fraud where, for example, the same accountant worked for 30 companies and you would recognize, or the same legal representative, or I mean, there were people associated with firms, and they would be associated with other firms. So the idea was to build a graph where you would find the centrality of these people, and that would lead you to suspicious behavior and so on. So maybe this that you worked on, this is very simple, of course, compared to what you did, but that would be one application which we left undone because we didn't have the data.
That was common knowledge out of the bureaucrats. But when we were there and we introduced the tools, they were able to actually map the networks and see them. There are accountants that work for hundreds of people or legal representatives. But there is a very big problem, and is that RUT data, root data, is very dirty. So you really have to spend a lot of time cleaning it, but very promising. And also something that James now works in many other sectors, and is the language of network science and the typology of problems is isomorphic to many other places. So it is not only tax fraud, it's whatnot. So lots of things to learn and apply to other other knowledge domains.
Great, but you're right. The complication here is to have clean data or good data. And I guess in the States would be easier, but here in Colombia, it's still a challenge to get good enough data.
We basically, when in James' dissertation, we show all the numbers, and we basically lose half the observations from beginning.
Still pretty good, not so bad.
half of the observations. Yeah, but we would make the dissertations available, and we would release working papers soon, and both James and I have now an industry slant, myself from public policy and James from all over the place. He's one of the most brilliant persons I know. So he's a genius, basically. So feel free to,
I will share with you a work we did in crime and networks. It's quite simple, but I was asking also about these dynamic networks because at the time when we did this, I didn't find anything interesting in dynamic networks. So, we just did whatever we thought it was reasonable, and well, we managed to publish it. But anyhow, we do like a lot this. So it would be nice if we keep in touch. And I'll send you this, and I will ask you for maybe some references and stuff like that for us to learn.
Absolutely. I just
yeah.
share with you the presentation. Yes, James.
Yeah, you're welcome, Divi, to share my email as well, if it's not already on the invite somewhere. I'm happy for anyone to reach out.
Okay, great. Thank you again.